Good afternoon. My name is Angela Saylor, and I'm the Vice President of the Fulner Institute here at the Heritage Foundation. On behalf of our President, Kay Coles James, welcome to our webinar, Biden Threatens to Undo the Work of Trump, Policies that Create an Economic Boom for Minority-Owned Businesses. It has been said before, American small businesses are the backbone of the American economy. Small businesses are responsible for 2/3 of all new job creation and employ over 60 million Americans. That is why so many small business owners like yourself are asking and wondering if the Biden administration will turn back Trump's specific economic policies that directly led to the economic boom for minority-owned businesses and the lower unemployment rates for Blacks and Hispanics. For the next 45 minutes, you're going to participate in a dynamic conversation with the Honorable Kevin Hassett, President Trump's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. He is going to share the facts about specific policies that created an economic boom for the minority community. Included in this dynamic discussion will be Raynard Jackson, President and CEO of Raynard Jackson and Associates. Gentlemen, as I introduce you, please join the screen. Kevin Hassett is currently Vice President and Managing Director of the Lindsay Group and a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. He previously served as Research Director at AEI, as a Senior Economist at the Federal Reserve, and as a faculty member at Columbia University. Hassett was also a senior advisor on Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign, and prior to that, he served as John McCain's chief economic advisor in the 2000 presidential primaries. And yes, an economic advisor to the campaigns of George W. Bush in 2004 and the presidential election, and McCain in the presidential election for 2008. Welcome, Raynard Jackson, President and CEO of Raynard Jackson and Associates, LLC, a government, public relations, and political consulting firm in Washington. He has a proven record of balancing public policy with fundamental freedoms associated with free markets. He writes a weekly syndicated newspaper column in over 200 newspapers, is a political analyst for TV station WUSA 9, the Washington, D.C. CBS affiliate, and had an award-winning internet radio show, Talking Right with Raynard Jackson. And that show has been recognized for the past 2 years in Talkers Magazine's Frontier 50. And the Frontier 50 is a selection of the top 50 most outstanding talk media webcasters. Gentlemen, welcome. Let's roll up our sleeves and jump into this incredible discussion about getting the facts right.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Angela.
So, Raynard, do you want to kind of jumpstart the conversation for us? I know that people are anxious to really hear the facts, and as I'm looking at Kevin, he's ready to give them.
Yes, thank you so much, Angela. Thanks to the Heritage Foundation, and thank you, Kevin, for taking out time to join us. I know you're busy. First question for you is, I do a lot of media, and I'm constantly been bombarded with what specifically did President Obama, or former President Obama, do? Did he do anything by way of policy that actually benefited the Black community and the small minority business community?
You know, I'm sure if you asked Obama administration, former Obama administration official, that they'd have a list of things, and if we looked at them, then maybe we would sort of say, yeah, that was something that had some merit, and that was something that didn't. But the bottom line is that the Obama administration, the headline economic thought is that they pursued policies like high marginal tax rates, heavy regulation that harm the economy. And that's why you might recall that before President Trump took office, that left-wing economists, not the economists at the Heritage Institution or Heritage Foundation, but they basically said that there's a new normal, that the economy is going to stink forever, that we're 1% growth is inevitable, And, wage growth has been flat for the entire Obama administration, and that's not his fault. It's the result of, basically exogenous forces or whatever. But the point was just that the policies were so bad, high marginal rates, highest corporate tax on earth, and so on, that there was basically very, very little or no wage growth for all Americans. Now, the thing about it is, though, that when you're thinking about the minority community, that there's very strong empirical evidence that basically it looks a little bit like that discrimination in hiring is less visible now. That the people who really studied like who gets hired, it looks like the hiring, there's not a lot of evidence of discrimination, but when for layoffs, it's still the case that when people control for the ability and seniority and everything else, that minorities tend to get laid off sooner. And so for me, there's still quite a bit of evidence that a weak economy hurts minorities the worst. And in part, I think that might be because of ongoing discrimination. But the bottom line is that really, really weak economy that President Trump inherited was the result of, at the macro level, really terrible policies that they tried to explain away with their excuse that it's a new normal, and policies that increased income inequality, suppressed wage growth, and so on.
So is it true or false that President Trump inherited a booming President Obama economy, and there's nothing he did in 4 years that benefited the small and minority business community? It was just a continuation of the Obama administration. Is that true or false?
Yeah, that's utterly false. And for those of folks who are participating, you could go to YouTube and just type in Kevin Hassett White House press conference. One of my first times where I actually ran the press conference, I had a whole bunch of charts that addressed that specifically. But the bottom line is we went from everybody saying there's a new normal and we can't have high growth, and that President Trump and his economic team are absolutely crazy because they said we can get 3% growth, to when we got 3% growth, everybody saying that, oh, well, they just, kept the Obama trends going. Right. And so when people are flipping their story like that, I mean, that's the kind of thing my mom used to catch me on all the time. Right. Yeah, you guys shouldn't be able to get away with that.
Well, explain to me then why President Trump kept repeating religiously the Black unemployment rate, the lowest in history, the Hispanic unemployment rate, the job participation rate for minorities have just plummeted since we've been keeping records. So reconcile that to, because what I'm hearing from the liberals is that President Trump did nothing, but yet the indicators indicate that something happened to lower the unemployment and job participation rates.
Yeah, the first thing I could say is that I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal last week that went through a lot of evidence. And one way that you can do this is that you can look at what the Congressional Budget Office said would have happened in the next few years, and then compare it to what actually happened. And in the Wall Street Journal article, what I did is, because the really first big policy other than deregulation that President Trump's team successfully enacted was the tax cuts. And I looked at what the Congressional Budget Office said would happen to the economy in the next few years. And then I compared it to what actually happened. And you could argue that the difference between what actually happened and what the professional forecasters thought would happen before they knew about the policy is a measure of the effect of the policy, right? And so 2 years after the tax cuts passed, already GDP was $300 billion a year higher than the CBO forecasted right before the tax cuts passed. About 2.5 million more people had jobs than the CBO thought was possible right before the tax cuts were passed. Capital spending was about $100 billion a year higher than the CBO thought would be possible before the tax cuts were passed. And you might recall that President Trump and you, Reynard, think a lot alike. That I went in one time it's almost the kind of conversation you and I have on the phone all the time, right? Where the president's like, well, so what have you guys been doing, to help people understand the benefits of the tax cuts? And I had this like presentation about the effect of the tax cuts on GDP. And the president looked at me like really frustrated, and he's like, people don't care about GDP. You care about GDP, fine. That might make you vote for it, but your vote isn't enough. So he made me really focus on what it would do for ordinary families, and translate it into family incomes. And when we did that, then our estimates suggested. I told the president this. I remember this conversation really significantly. I said that it'll add $4,000 to $9,000 a year to the income of the average family if we pass these tax cuts. And then President Trump said, that's it. So 4,000, that's a family income. That's the kind of thing that I want to talk. That's my voice. I can hear myself talking about that. I'm not talking about GDP, he said. And I'm also going to take the lower number, he said, because I don't want to overpromise. I'm not pie in the sky guy. So let's give him the conservative number. You said it's 4,000 to 9,000. Let's say that we're going to do 4,000. And you might recall that when we did that, the amount of heat that we took, right? Everybody said it was crazy. One Harvard professor who shall not be named said that I'm paraphrasing, that I'm either stupid or a liar or both, because of that number. But as I put in the Journal article last week, if you look at what happened in the 2 years after the tax cuts, then the median income for the median family went up just in those first 2 years by $4,900. And so just like, and it was like 6,000 something over the entire Trump term. And so the point is just that at the aggregate level for everybody, those policies really worked. But because we got the economy so hot, that had a really, really big positive disproportionate effect on minority communities. And I can tell you that I brief the president on economic data all the time. It's a little thing that Washington insiders know, but the CEA chair, the job I had, gets the economic data the day before, and then the CEA chair shares the data with the Fed chair and the Treasury secretary and the president. And so we didn't, a lot of times, so like if I go in there and there's like a purchasing managers index number that's interesting or whatever, then I want to talk to the president, that General Kelly would tell me take a hike, right? Like, but if there's like an important number, that you would get in there and you would talk to him, and he always wanted to know what was going on, basically for different income groups, for supervisors and non-supervisors, and for people by race. And I don't think I ever saw him as pleased as he was for economic data as he was when we presented the data on what was going on in the Black community, when the hot economy that our policies created started to have really, really big effects. And I know that this is a conversation, but when you have a conversation with a nerd, you get what you pay for. And I brought a couple of slides, and there's more slides that we're going to talk about. But if we could just go to I had 2 slides on just sort of some economic facts about how the Trump economy influenced Black workers. And so yeah, I've got just 2 slides, but just to put it in perspective, the unemployment rate for Black Americans hit 5.2% in August 2019, which is the lowest it ever was in history. Okay, lowest in history. The following month, the unemployment rate for female Black Americans achieved a record low of 4.3%. The Black American labor force participation rate hit its highest post-recession rate in December.
Kevin, can you explain to people what the job participation rate means vis-a-vis the unemployment rate?
Yeah. So one of the problems, and this is a problem that's especially the devil's people who are trying to monitor the welfare of people in the Black community, is that that when they have like the unemployment rate, then they count you as unemployed if you're in the labor force and don't have a job. And being in the labor force means you're looking for a job. But I think that anybody who's ever had a job interview that you really liked and then not gotten the job, and like if you apply for a job and you don't get one a few times, it's very easy to get frustrated and to give up hope and to stop looking for a job. And so the unemployment rate doesn't count people who are out of the labor force, which means that they're unemployed, but they're so discouraged that they've stopped looking for a job. And historically, those folks have, and again, because of a legacy of discrimination and everything else that we could talk about, historically, those discouraged workers has disproportionately been minorities. And so one of the things you want to see is, like, if you really have a booming inclusive economy, then not only do you want the unemployment rate to be low, but if the unemployment rate's low, but you still have a whole bunch of discouraged people who aren't looking for a job, then you're not really helping the disadvantaged the way you would want to, right? So you want to see people getting jobs, and you want to see people coming back into the labor force because their friends got jobs, so they heard, hey, it's a good time for me to get back in there. And so the participation rate just means that to get the participation rate to its highest ever, that means that you got a whole bunch of people that were discouraged and frustrated and had given up hope, and you got them to come back into the labor force. And so that's what
I mean, they're optimistic about the future.
Yeah, and optimistic about their own chance of getting a job. And then, real median household income achieved a record high in 2019, increasing $4,000 in just 3 years. And basically, over the entire Obama administration, median household income for Black Americans declined over those 14 years going back to 2002, actually declined by $76. And so that you took a world where basically they're treading water at best and turned it into a world where things are really booming and things are really getting better. And can we see the next slide, please? I mean, this is these, and I could tell you that I can remember, talking in the Oval Office about these facts with the president, and just like the joy that it gave him. And you could see that too when he went out on the stump and he would mention these facts all the time. And we had to update them. Gosh, we had people whose full-time job it was to update these things because he cared so much about them. But the poverty rate for Black Americans fell to the lowest rate on record in 2019. And about 1 million Black Americans were lifted out of poverty during the first 3 years of the Trump administration. And the other thing was that you could just sort of say, oh, well, he just lucked into a booming economy. And so, the Black Americans, were not keeping up or might not have been keeping up with everybody else. But if you see, like, the next bullet point, that the weekly earnings, the typical median usual weekly earnings for Black workers went up 4.1% per year over that time, which was higher than it was for white workers. And so that, absolutely the economy disproportionately benefited Black Americans during those years. And then the final thing is that home ownership rate skyrocketed too, because since folks had money, then they had steady jobs, then they could afford down payments and they could convince banks to make loans to them and in order for them to get a house and so on. And so it really was a revolutionary time. I think we can stop sharing the slides now. A revolutionary time for the country in terms of changing what we think about what's possible with an economy. But also we showed that if you have like high tax, high regulation policies, that's going to hurt businesses, and that's going to cost jobs, and that when that happens, that harm disproportionately hits minorities, and if you do the opposite, if you reverse it, you disproportionately benefit minorities. And so the concern would be now that President Biden's proposals will reverse this stuff. And I think if he does that, then it'll be just a crying shame.
So Kevin, as we're looking at the stats, and as Reynard is really trying to pull out the accomplishments under the Trump administration, and we talked about Obama, and now we're kind of booked in here with Obama, Trump, and now Biden. And we also have this interesting dynamic of COVID and trying to do a recovery here. Can you talk a little bit about what small businesses should be doing now, what they should be listening for as the new administration is putting forth their policy recommendations, and why it's critical at this moment to be on our toes about what's next, and how small businesses can really impact the direction of where the economy goes for the country.
Right. And it's a really important question you ask, Angela. And the thing I can say about it, that's the first thing in terms of sort of legacy things about, how our country's evolved over time, is that there are a heck of a lot of small businesses that are minority owned. About a little less than a third of small businesses are minority owned. They employ 7 million people, account for about $1 trillion a year of GDP. And if you look at the data, there's something interesting too, which is that probably, okay, so now I'd have to fact check this to say it. So I'm just putting a caution ahead of this. But the last time I looked carefully at the numbers, you could make the case that the most entrepreneurial demographic group in the United States is Black females. That there are just enormous number of small businesses that are run by Black females, and so when you do something that helps small business, then you're going to disproportionately benefit that community. And I have basically, we've talked about sort of legacy problems, which no one can deny in this country. But one of my theories is that that discouraged folks who apply for a job and then they don't get it, and then they apply for a job and they don't get it. Discouraged folks with spunk start a business. Like, well, the heck with that, I'm going to start a business. If they're not going to hire me, I'm going to hire me. And because there is a puzzle almost, you could sort of explain why so many folks, especially in the past, were starting small businesses. And so what President Trump's policies did was basically they deregulated and by lowering marginal tax rates made it so that small businesses could keep more of their money and use it to create jobs. And when we looked at this was one of the, I would say, top 5 puzzles for me, or things that I got wrong. And when I get stuff wrong, I'm puzzled. My wife is never puzzled when I'm wrong, but of course he's wrong. It's Kevin. But I was puzzled. And what happened was that we started this. Remember, President Trump had a rule that you had to get rid of 2 regulations if you're going to introduce one, but then we outperformed that by about, almost 10, almost no new regulations were introduced. But I thought that the regulation effect would be really positive, but that it would take like 10 years to be visible, because like regulations are kind of this complicated thing. But it turned out that when we sort of stopped the new regulations, it had a massive positive effect on small businesses and on minority-owned small businesses.
Is there anything specific that you can think of, Kevin, that benefited the small minority community as far as deregulation?
Yeah. So what I was going to, the big thought, I was just about to get there. The big thought is this: that so when I talked to basically friends who run businesses, or basically the small business associations here in town, I learned something that as an economist, since I don't have any real world experience, it was obviously that I would miss. Probably Reynard would have known this already. But the real problem is, so there's all these regulations out there, right? And if you're a business that's operating like you operated last year, then you operated last year because you had sort of figured out how to deal with those things, right? So you got to do this, you got to do that, and you do those things, and then the regulators leave you alone, and then you can run your business. If we introduce a new regulation, then you're like, crap, I got to figure out how this new regulation affects what I do. And you got to hire lawyers, and you got to hire engineers, and you got to get people to sort of, and you as a business manager, instead of thinking about how am I going to, maximize my business, you're thinking about how am I going to deal with this regulation. And so in the Obama administration, those new regulations, they grew at the highest rate we've ever seen for a president. About 9% a year, believe it or not, economically significant regulations went up. And so what that meant was, and this is the thing that surprised me, that once we stopped doing that, then small business sentiment and small business activity and small business hiring and everything went through the roof right away. And then when we dug into it, and American Action Forum, Doug Holt-Seekin's really excellent group across town. I guess they're quasi a competitor for you guys at Heritage, but they did an estimate that already by the summer of halfway through President Trump's first year, that small businesses had spent 5 million fewer man hours complying with new regulations. And instead, those 5 million hours were spent, making cupcakes or whatever it is the small businesses were doing. And I think that's like really the big thing that happened for small business.
Yeah.
Well, I love the way you frame that, because oftentimes we talk about limited government in kind of a broad speaking terms. But when you talk about limited government in relationship to like regulation, it starts to make practical sense and why you want to push the government back away from your day-to-day dealings. So I really appreciate the way you broke that down. And it seems like we should say to folks that your hair should get a little on fire when you start hearing the R word, the regulation word. And that's something people should be listening out for as this administration is putting forth policy. Reynard, I didn't want to cut you off. It looked like
no problem. You said something interesting earlier, Kevin, that about the Black job participation rate and the minority job participation rate. People, when that number goes up, that means people are optimistic about the future, about the economy. But then at the same time, how do you reconcile that optimism? But yet, if you listen to the liberal narrative, President Trump was so polarizing, especially within the minority community. So why would you be optimistic about the Trump policy at the same time he's supposed to be so polarizing? Or is there a way to reconcile those?
Yeah, just being an economist, that I could say that if I'm looking at the economic data and thinking about the things that we care about, and then that stuff was heading north in a big way, in a way that was unexpected by all the forecasters. But politics is about a lot more than just economics. And I think that the police violence and all of the stresses that all of our communities have dealt with over the last few years had a big political impact. And whether President Trump dealt with them in the optimal way or not is something political scientists will probably talk about for a long time, but probably a whole bunch of them will say he didn't. I don't know. I don't know politics. I know economics. And all I can say is that one of my, when I teach college classes or give a lecture at a university, one of my favorite little tricks to do, and I did this. I taught a class at Georgetown last semester, and it kind of always works. And it's really quite fun. Is that you just get the students to be involved in a conversation. What does a just society look like? That if society got a little bit better, in the way that you care about, what would have happened? Like things you can measure. Yeah, how do and then pretty much everybody's always like, well, I want people at the bottom. I want poverty to be going down. I want inequality to be going down. I want climate. I want carbon emissions going down. And if you talk to college students, for sure, that definitely is going to be one of the top 5 that they mentioned. But the issue is just that once you list all those 5 things, you can then, I don't know if you ever saw Warner Wolf. I used to live in New York, who did the best. He did the best sort of like sports highlights at the end of his sports segment. Let's go to the videotape, right? And so if you go to the videotape and then list the things that, so if you're a person who believes in social justice, then you want declining income inequality. Well, then President Trump's your man. The Gini coefficient, which is a thing geeky economists use to measure inequality, actually improved, in a remarkable way under the Trump, especially after the Trump tax cuts. And wages grew fastest at the bottom. The strong labor market benefited minority, historically disadvantaged minority communities the most. And so that when we do that, when I play that trick and then go through it with the students, it kind of whacks them over the head. It's like, wow, that's not what I expected at all. And so I think that what that means too is that people like me, you haven't done a good job of breaking through with the facts. And maybe and maybe it's because voters care a lot about other things that economists don't do. Right. But if you really just could get through, I really do feel like the fact that the facts are so surprising to people is in some sense a metric of failure of guys like me.
Right.
Well, I want to just say to all of our participants, we want you in this conversation. And if you've got a question, please go to the question box and send it in to us so that we can ask Kevin to address it head on. Kevin, as we talk more comprehensively about small businesses, the economy across the board in our very special country, America, we've got some other aspects that play into it, you know, education, looking at the development of the workforce, and President Trump did some other things in those areas that I think you would love to talk about in terms of how that impacts small business, how that impacts a healthy society, and impacts our ability to be globally competitive.
Yeah, I mean there was so much action in this space that you know, one of the things that we did is we put together this big jobs commission. It had some kind of name, which again, it's one of those things that math guys like me do all the time, is we forget the exact name of the thing. But there was this task force for the worker, something like the task force for the American worker, and they got companies all around the country to commit to create apprenticeships. And you know, I can remember being shocked that within sort of 6 months, like, although I learned how effective Ivanka Trump is, and so I shouldn't have been shocked, but within a few months there were 3 million people in apprenticeships that wouldn't have had them if they hadn't started this program. And sort of helping connect people to jobs was something that was a real focus of ours and a real focus of the president's. And it was actually one of my first Twitter experience with President Trump was this, that I went in because the labor market was getting pretty tight, but the unemployment rate wasn't falling maybe as fast as he wanted, you know, because he always wanted better data than we had, no matter how good it was. And so he's sort of like, well, geez, if there's all these job openings, then why isn't the unemployment rate dropping faster? And then, you know, I had this presentation for him, which I gave him in the Oval, sitting right across the Resolute desk, where I showed that basically there were places, and I can remember the place at the time that was the tightest was Colorado for some reason. And in Colorado, there was like more than one job opening per unemployed worker. Right. But then there were some other places that I think Mississippi was one where, you know, that there was sort of like one job opening for 4 unemployed workers. And so one of the things we said to him was that, well, you know, there's kind of like a mismatch, a geographic mismatch between where the jobs are and where the unemployed people are. And then the president became sort of obsessed with you know, because there's other reasons why there's mismatches, like skills and things like that. And so we ended up having a very broad agenda based on the basic idea of let's try to fix the mismatch. But right when I left the Oval, I got back to my office, but like by the time I got to my office, which is like about a 1-minute walk from the Oval, that he had tweeted, you know, hey, if you're having trouble finding a job, you should move.
Oh my goodness. Well, look, we
did have a lot of policies involved in job training, again, supporting education, historically Black colleges, and so on, and also helping basically prisoners get back into society and get back, but not be recidivists, but be trained so that they could come out and have a job. You know, it was a very active, focused effort by the White House to address those disadvantaged communities.
Well, we have a question from Ms. Donovan from David Harris Jr. Media, and she's asking if you could please discuss in your opinion, and looking at the achievements of the administration, President Trump's biggest economic benefit that people have overlooked?
Well, I think the biggest benefit part is that what I can jump right to, which is just that that the average or median American family over his 4 years, even with the pandemic, saw their income go up by a little less than $7,000, and that was a striking accomplishment, given that it had basically been flat for more than the previous decade. And so I don't know if that's really underappreciated, but I think that was probably like the biggest thing that I can think of. That within the regulatory front, he established something which I think will at least be a model, should be a model for all administrations, but will be a model for conservative administrations from now on, which he did something that Ronald Reagan, nobody had ever thought to do before, which is he gave every cabinet agency a regulatory budget. Just because he's a pragmatic businessman, he's like, well, so the regulatory budget basically meant was that if you're going to add a regulation, then you have to subtract one. And if you got a regulation that's going to cost a little bit more, then you got to cut a regulation that covers the cost of that thing. And so he gave everybody a regulatory budget. He made them actually show how their budget worked, and making people budget. Angela's shaking her head as a person who's a very skilled manager. She knows, like, you give people budgets, then hold them accountable, then you get results. And I think an underappreciated thing is how much was accomplished by deregulation. Casey Mulligan led a team for me at CEA that estimated how much we had saved Americans in money, because if a business spends less money on regulation, then they can sell you the product for cheaper, right? We estimated that the typical American, and this is over and above the $7,000, saved about $3,500 a year, in the sense that they paid less for the stuff they consumed because the regulatory costs had dropped so much. And they did that because the president did what Angela does when she manages things. She gives people a budget.
Reynard.
Oh, wow.
Oh, I was going to say, Reynard, back over to you with, I know you had a few more questions about HBCUs and the First Step Act. And I just, again, want to remind people to keep your questions coming. We want to make sure we get them all addressed. So back to you, Reynard.
Yes. How did the President Trump's economic policy affect the ability of more students, especially at HBCUs, to not only get engaged in the education process? And what did he do to specifically help the HBCUs who are under a lot of financial distress navigate that tough road there?
Okay, yeah, so the first thing he did, and this is one of the first things he did, is he moved the Federal Historically Black Colleges and Universities Initiative back to the White House, so that it was the White House that was basically, making sure that things were happening. He didn't want any red tape getting, between him and success on this issue. He signed into law something called the Future Act, which made permanent $255 million in annual funding for HBCUs. And also expanded Pell Grants. Signed legislation that included $100 million for scholarships to HBCUs, and forgave $322 million in disaster loans to HBCUs. So I mean, there were very, very big, important, and the other thing about HBCUs, which have served such an important, still do, role in our society, is that they don't have necessarily the endowment that Harvard has, right? And so if you forgive $322 million in disaster loans to Harvard, it's not going to have any effect on Harvard. But these, I think that these policies were essential, really, for the continued success of those essential institutions.
Right. One other question: liberals tend to say that, well, President Trump's tax cuts were a tax cut for the wealthy. Is that true, number one? Then number two, the $3 trillion that President Trump expropriated back to the U.S. by lowering the tax rate because the money was parked by all the major corporations overseas because of the tax rate. What did that do to the economy, and did it trickle down to the small and minority business community?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the thing about the tax code that we had when we took over, and maybe the one that we'll have again if President Biden is successful in reversing this, is that it was just the stupidest tax code ever. One of I didn't quite cause an international controversy, but I probably got a little bit overboard. At one point, I was at an event with the Prime Minister of Ireland, and we were talking about the U.S. tax reform in a Q&A. And then I said with the Prime Minister of Ireland there that the one theory that has not been disproven to me is that the U.S. corporate tax code was written by somebody on acid. I was making a joke, I know, but I probably shouldn't have done it, because it got a little more attention than it should have. But here's an example of what the code would allow to happen. So let's say, Reynard, that you and I had a business. I don't know, we make baseballs or something. We've been making them forever, and we had made lots of money. And then, prior to the Trump tax reform, and suppose we'd done that in the U.S. forever and ever. Let's say we're selling baseballs for $10 a piece. Then somebody comes to us and say, hey, you should put your baseball factory in Ireland. Because if you put your baseball factory in Ireland, then you'll pay the Irish tax, which is almost nothing. We have the highest corporate tax on earth. In Ireland, there's almost no tax. And sure, you would pay the U.S. tax if you mail the money home, but just leave the money overseas. You'll never pay the U.S. tax, right? And so then what we do is we set up the factory in Ireland. I want to run through the math of it. It's very simple math, but it shows how ridiculous this is, how the acid thing is actually an accurate statement. So we set up the factory in Ireland, and then all we have to do is have our Irish subsidiary sell to us, the parents, Reynard and Kevin's baseball company, sell us baseballs to sell in the U.S. for $11. So they sell it to us for $11. So the parent pays the sub $11. We sell the baseball for $10 in the U.S. And so in the U.S. we have a $1 loss, and then there's a massive profit in Ireland, right? But in Ireland there's no tax on the profit. Well, that $1 loss, those pile up. Under the U.S. code, we can carry losses back and get refunded taxes that we paid in the past. Right, and so what basically happens is we get a tax refund that finances the construction of our plant in Ireland. It's like the stupidest thing ever, and everybody was doing it, and the U.S. revenue was cratering, and all the jobs are being created overseas, and that happened to the tune of basically, as you said, that there were trillions and trillions of dollars locked overseas because people had avoided U.S. tax with this trick. Which didn't, so imagine, again, you and I, when we play that trick, then, the U.S. government doesn't get any tax revenue out of us anymore. In fact, they're giving us a refund on past revenue. And so the really high corporate tax in the U.S. doesn't really hurt us because we just don't pay it. We moved to Ireland, so it's like almost irrelevant to us as the rich capitalists that own the baseball company. But who does it hurt? It hurts the worker who used to make the baseballs in the U.S. Right? So that guy who's got all those skills for stitching them up or whatever, that guy's job is gone. So who does that corporate tax hurt? Well, it doesn't hurt us. It hurts the worker. And so let's say we reverse it. Who does it help? Well, it's not going to actually help us that much because we were avoiding it already. But it's going to help the workers in the U.S. because there's no longer going to be a reason to move their jobs overseas. And that's what we saw happen. And so all that money did come back, and it had a really big positive effect on the economy.
Well, Kevin, we've got a couple of more questions in the queue, and we're running up on our time. We're starting to run up. So I want to make sure we get to them. And Reynard, I want you to jump in on this part of the discussion too, as we start to talk about plans leaving out of this webinar in terms of doing some roundtables with small business owners and really digging in and hearing their thoughts and talking about the policies that need to continue to be pushed forward to ensure that they are vibrant and profitable and adding to our success as a nation to be competitive. So Kevin, one person is just asking a real down home question here. How can we just do a better job of conveying these results to communities of color and to talk about the tangible results? And I think this is a question we keep asking ourselves as a movement. How do we do a better job of communicating all the good news here?
I think honestly, the world's leading expert on that, other than you, Angela, is Reinhard. I think that's what he's devoted his life to, and I think that as an economist, in the end, all I can do is sort of carefully construct like the facts and make sure that they're accurate and so on. But it might surprise you to learn that most economists aren't very good at communicating.
I never would have guessed that, Kevin.
That's been my experience. But I do
so
think
Reinhard, take that one on.
I'll give you all the MOU.
Yeah, and also let's talk about the benefit and power of having the information and knowledge and what that can do to change your life.
Yeah. Well, I think, Angela, definitely you and I and Heritage Foundation continuing to do things like this, that addresses your concern about getting the message out there, because I'm sure we have a lot of listeners in the audience who probably have never heard these types of statistics thrown around that prove that President Trump actually did do specific policy prescriptions that turned the economy hot, especially towards the small and minority business communities. And so I think, as a follow-up to what we're doing today, Angela, you said these roundtables, if the audience has any specific subject matter that they want to dig deeper into, anything that Kevin has talked about, maybe we can take suggestions from the audience through email, and they can communicate their thoughts with us, and then we can build roundtables around where they're the interest from the audience, and use that as the next step, because we don't want this just to be a one and done. We want to continue this dialogue with the community out there and continue to promote what Heritage is doing by way of some of their research on these issues.
Well, it's so interesting. Right now, today, we've got a group of people gathered in Philadelphia talking about economic issues and talking about education and how more of our organizations can come together and collaborate to really push more policies that will be extremely beneficial to the small business community and to the nation as a whole, and how we do a better job of bolstering small businesses in our conversation and our messaging as assets to America, and really pushing forth those stories and trying to build and strengthen those relationships. And what we know for sure, Reynard and Kevin, is that it's going to require partnership and a long-term commitment, and that's what we're doing. And we know that it's a two-way activity in terms of listening and sharing of information back and forth over models that work. And so, Reynard, as we're looking at these roundtables, we got to know from the perspective of the small business owner exactly how these policies really impacted their business from their viewpoint on a personal level, as we talk about it kind of more from a national standpoint. And I think that helps to galvanize the support and gets people listening for the R word, regulation, of understanding how that's going to become detrimental. And for our young people, I mean, we are going to continue to do training programs and internships and looking and reaching into communities that we haven't engaged as much in the past, to make sure that people are informed and aware of those opportunities and initiatives. And so, Kevin, to you, I want to thank you so much for your time. You are an economist, but you were very, very thoughtful in your presentation and very clear in terms of your communication to help break down some of these concepts for us. And I think people have appreciated it. And Reynard, to you, I want to thank you for the partnership And for our listening audience, again, we will be in touch with you about our upcoming roundtables. They will be smaller. They will allow for us to be able to see your face and engage with you virtually to really have a strong engagement about these also important issues. And we look forward to, again, continuing to have these discussions. And a part of this discussion, I think, Reynard, as you were advocating for, was to have a little bit of a tough conversation that people kind of push under the carpet and get it out there in the public square and have an honest conversation about it. So thank you for your vision there. And on behalf of our president, Kay Coles James, and the Heritage family, thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to continuing to build a long and healthy relationship with you. Thanks.
Thank you.